Well, hello and welcome to everyone joining us for this X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Accelerating Psychiatry Clinical Trials Through a Patient-Centric Approach, Real Patients, Real Outcomes. My name is Corey Stanton and I'll be your X-Talks host for this event. Today's presentation runs for approximately 60 minutes and the webinar includes an interactive Q&A session at the end. To make the most of this session, feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation and we'll try to attend to as many as possible. If you're joining us via GoToWebinar, you can use the questions chat box, which is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you require any assistance, please don't hesitate to contact me by sending a message using this very same chat box. And if you're viewing this presentation from our LinkedIn Live event, you can submit your questions using the comments tab on LinkedIn. Please note that all audience members are in listen-only mode and that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming to those who registered on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank MedPace, who developed the content for this presentation. MedPace is a scientifically driven, global, full-service clinical contract research organization, or CRO, providing phase 1 through 4 clinical development services to the biotechnology, pharmaceutical, and medical device industries. MedPace's mission is to accelerate the global development of safe and effective medical therapeutics through its high science and disciplined operating approach that leverages local regulatory and deep therapeutic expertise across all major areas. And now let's take a moment to meet our panelists for today's presentation. One of our speakers is Dr. James Voronov. Dr. Voronov is a board-certified neurologist and renowned clinician scientist with over 18 years of experience in neurology and psychiatry clinical development. At MedPace, he provides medical leadership for neuroscience clinical research, guiding both sponsors and internal teams. Dr. Voronov has directed programs across various therapeutic areas, including depression, Parkinson's disease, stroke, and neuropathic pain. He holds a BA in biology from Columbia University and an MD and PhD from Emory University School of Medicine. Also joining us today is Ms. Daniela Ray. Ms. Ray is a consultant nurse in London, United Kingdom, with nearly 20 years of senior clinical and research leadership experience in neuroscience, focusing on neurodegenerative and neuropsychiatric diseases. As an advanced clinical practitioner at MedPace, she offers a patient and site-centric perspective to support clinical operations, medical monitoring, and other functional areas. Her expertise spans complex psychiatric patient management in clinical practice and trial settings. She holds an MSc in Public Health and Health Services Research from the University of Aberdeen and completed a Scottish Government Advanced Research Fellowship. I'm also pleased to welcome Ms. Jill Adkins today. Ms. Adkins is an accomplished clinical research professional with more than 24 years of experience working in the drug development industry across all study phases. She has over 7 years of direct study management experience in psychiatry indications, including studies of controlled substances requiring close medication adherence monitoring and management. At MedPace, Ms. Adkins is part of the neuroscience leadership team and leads the neuropsychiatry working group with a focus on implementing operational best practices for studies in psychiatry, sleep disorders, and related indications. And rounding out the panel today is Ms. Maisha Campbell. Ms. Campbell is a seasoned professional with over 17 years of experience leading a global team in strategic marketing, patient recruitment, and retention for multi-million-dollar campaigns. She oversees the planning and execution of tailored programs, focusing on site and patient needs across various phases and therapeutic areas. Ms. Campbell graduated from California State University at Dominguez Hills in 2002 with a Bachelor of Arts in English and a minor in communications, transitioning from public relations to clinical trial marketing in 2007. And now, without any further ado, I'd like to hand the mic over to our first speaker, Dr. James Voronov. Dr. Voronov, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, and welcome to everyone listening to this webinar. So it's really gratifying that over the last couple of years, our team at MedPace has seen a real increase in the number of clinical development programs in psychiatric indications coming from our biotech sponsors. And it's driven in part by new understandings of neuroscience in the brain, new understandings of mental health. And I think as we've put together in the last few years, some new approaches that actually had to do trials in psychiatry, which we think of as being patient-centric. And we're going to be talking about all those aspects because, you know, continues to be a huge unmet medical need. We have many drugs that are useful in treating our psychiatric patients, but really we haven't brought patients really to the level that would be fully functional and really mitigating the problems. And it's more than just people not feeling well or not functioning well. it's integral to people's well-being to have good mood, have motivation in daily activities with their families and work life. And it's extremely common. 1 in 8 people globally, sometime during their life, suffer from some significant symptoms of mental illness. And the consequences are large, both for health, with an increased risk of mortality, and of course, lots of other morbidities that come along with that, with suicide being perhaps one of the most disturbing sides of the mortality, with high risk in young people, in veterans, and other groups. And as well, there's a very high economic burden with lost work, disruption of lives, and need for public support of people who can't care for themselves. You can go to the next slide. So when we look at clinical trials, this actually was taught to me many years ago by a medical writer, that we tend to overcomplicate clinical trials because really the elements of a clinical trial are very simple. We take a group of people out of the community, the population that we're going to study, and then of course we do something to them. There's a treatment, often it's placebo control, sometimes it's versus standard of care, and then we measure what we've done to them during the course of the clinical trials. And of course, we usually measure something before to compare to afterwards, but of course, not always. So I'm just going to briefly talk about what makes clinical trials in psychiatry different from these 3 simple points of view. Go to the next slide. So the population, it's really different than most other medically defined diseases. Hypertension, we have clear guidelines about an objective measure of blood pressure. We have imaging for cancer. We have pulmonary tests for lung disease. And here we're talking about how people feel, their subjective states. And there's been a shift, I think, as you can see in the top line, from really a very strong medical model that we developed over the years of talking about people with mental illness, that there were people who were healthy and normal, and then there were people who were mentally ill. Whereas now I think more holistically, we think about it as mental health. We know that everyone gets low mood at times, but there are some populations through individual differences who become depressed and then find themselves in a hole that they can't get themselves out of through any of their own efforts. And of course, that's where medication and treatment helps. And so looking at patients more than just isolated disease populations, but looking at this as a spectrum of restoring people to their best possible mental health, I think is a change in how we look at our treatments. We're not trying to cure a disease or an illness. We're trying to make people more functional and better. And then in the bottom 2 panels, you can see that we've also realized over the years in these trials that one size doesn't fit all. We have a concept of personalized medicine coming out of lots of areas, oncology, our neurodegenerative diseases, where now we recognize there are genetic markers of disease, which distinguish one population from another. And of course, those genetic markers often predict what treatment will work the best. The understanding of neural mechanisms in the brain and the limbic system and executive function and exactly what is going wrong in patients who have mental health problems is much more advanced than it was in years past. We know that any good psychiatrist goes on history of previous response to treatment. And very often our trials have been patients who have failed everything trying a new treatment, where now we understand that some of these genetic, environmental, neural mechanisms cause a patient to respond better to one catecholamine inhibitor, for example, than another. Some patients have clinical characteristics of more anxiety. Some have trouble sleeping. Some sleep too much. Some are activated and irritable with their disease. Others are quiet. And of course, the treatment, as we manipulate brain networks and systems, we're now realizing really needs to be tailored to those patients. So what we're seeing now are trials which are addressing either specific populations with base symptoms, which we think our drug is going to help, or isolating populations with are enriched in those kind of symptoms. The second part is that, especially as we exited the blockbuster drug period of psychiatric development and trials were failing with huge placebo effects, I think we started realizing that the patients going into trials were not the real world patients that were getting treated with drugs in the clinic. We pushed for rapid enrollment, and there's good clinical evidence been published that that often leads to a failed trial, because we're telling our investigators, just fill the trial, let us get it done, and then we'll see whether or not it worked, rather than working with our sites to pick appropriate patients. And of course, when we get patients who haven't responded to anything, who for whatever reason show up at our sites, they may not be the kind of community patients that are most likely to respond to treatment. So what we've been working towards in recent years is really trying to find more community-based, real-world patients who are more likely to respond to our therapies. Next slide. And of course, our therapies are changing. You know, the blockbuster era was driven by a large number of psychiatric drugs in brand new categories, you know, tricyclics, SSRIs, benzodiazepines. And we got this idea that we were administering drugs which changed the chemical balance in the brain. It was very neurotransmitter and receptor based. We were suppressing hyperactive states, and we were activating and lifting mood. And of course, it takes a little while for you to shift the limbic system, but more or less that's what our trials were doing. They were relatively short, and they were aimed at these large changes in state. Now, in recent years, part of the excitement has come from, we've realized that this state change that takes a while with some therapies can occur very rapidly with drugs like ketamine and neurosteroids. So if you can cure someone's depression in an hour or two, then the question is, how do you keep them in that long-term state? Do you just have to treat them every once in a while? But if you can now start looking at it more of restoration of normal mood, then it becomes a question of a secondary prevention of keeping people in that. And of course, in the last, I think we now realize that, again, with moving away from a purely medical model to one that's a little bit more holistic, we realize that mental health problems are driven by stressors in large part. Those can be economic, social, you know, school, marriage, being in a war, trauma, and disabilities are all from your mental illness, are all stressors which keep you in the state. So even though the drug might be effective at shifting you to a better state, these traits that are longer lasting can continue on. And so we see trials where we combine our therapy with other interventions, such as counseling, cognitive behavioral therapy. Next slide. And finally, as much of the rest of medicine, especially in neurology, we now have biomarkers that are able to give us better diagnosis, better characters of patients, show us the effect of our therapy, even when the effects clinically can be relatively modest. In psychiatry, we use validated and reliable self-reporting, often through a skilled interviewer, for our rating scales. And we sort of have this paradox, as I say, because those work. We have all the drugs that we have in psychiatry have all been based on these kind of subjective scales. And of course, no wonder that's what our clinical benefit that we're looking for is all subjective from the patient's point of view. But all of the scales, we realize they are very imperfect. Many of them were actually just organized around the kind of blockbuster era drugs that we had, the Hamilton, the Madras, the PANS. They're based on suppressing psychosis, increasing mood, treating some of the somatic symptoms of depression. And, they're plagued by recall bias. Patient comes into the clinic and we're asking them about how did they feel over some period of time in the past. Well, we know that most recent events have the greatest impact on how you self-rate, or unusual events or have very strong recall bias. And of course, then there's the placebo effect, expectation bias, rater variability between raters, and drift within raters. And patients also really vary in their verbal ability and insight. So when you talk to someone and ask them how they feel, their ability to express it in large part depends on having a very good interviewer who can interpret it accurately and draw out those from the patient. And the complementary assessments that we've been trying for as long as I've been in drug development just haven't really panned out. Wearables, you'd think that things like actigraphy and activity would be some kind of a useful measure. Biomarkers, the cortisol axis, other sorts of measures, disability scales, they all have for one reason or another, they fail to reflect the effect of drugs better than simple subjective assessment. So go to the next slide. So that's sort of where we are, and where we've been going is to take these limitations and where we are in terms of our patient populations and improve protocol and trial design, recognizing this complexity and not simple inclusion-exclusion criteria, but do things like do run-in designs, parallel designs to minimize bias and placebo responses. We focus on the sites and encourage them to select patients rather than just filling up the trial with who they can find that they can reasonably say meet inclusion-exclusion criteria. And then looking at going into the community, finding these real patients and avoiding unresponsive chronic patients who are maybe unlikely to respond to the kind of treatments that we've been developing. And we work very closely as a CRO with our sponsors to bring the experience and expertise that we've gained to try to get better patient appropriateness and ecological validity in the patients, doing rater training and oversight, all things that cost money, make trials run longer, increase screen failures. But we think in the end, this kind of all of the above approach of doing everything we can to make trials more sensitive is worth it in the end. And I think we've seen more sensitive trials, running trials this patient-centric way. So now we're going to look at the individual aspects here. So let me turn it over to Daniela, who's going to talk about the patient experience in clinical trials.
Thank you, James, for the great introduction to the webinar today. And in this section, I would like to speak on one of the key aspects James mentioned in his first slide, the participants or the patients themselves. Psychiatric illness is complex and multifaceted, and potential participants often present with a multitude of heterogeneous symptoms, as well as psychiatric and physical comorbidities. I will speak on a few specific factors here, beginning off with the unseen and often underestimated burden of psychiatric illness and associated disability. I'm not able to cover all points, but it's worth noting that none of these can be seen in isolation, and they all interrelate with each other, and often already are barriers for participation. So the effects of psychiatric illness on cognition is often under-recognized, and individuals commonly experience poor concentration and memory difficulties. In addition, effects on overall executive functioning abilities lead to reduced capability to take steps to complete tasks or actions, as well as the inability to commit to a certain course of action. Overall cognitive flexibility is reduced, making it difficult to adjust goals and strategies to ever-changing situation life throws at any one of us. Cognitive struggles are often the underpinnings of poor functional ability and compliance with very ordinary activities of daily living, and are often characteristic of the disorganized lifestyle individual with mental health problems have. And of course, not to forget here, some cognitive abilities can be further exacerbated by side effects of any psychiatric medication that might be used. And of course, all of the above skills we have touched on are really critical in making trial participation successful for any given participant. And this starts simply with a consent and the capacity to understand and digest complex information, but also adhering to study schedule and complying with medication regimes. In this context, it is important to empower and enable research sites to accommodate patients rather than patients accommodating study schedules. The ability to provide consent is not only important during initial consent giving for study participation, but also retaining ability to consent throughout the duration of the trial. And in this context, it is worth considering implementing a formal process for assessment or at least documentation as it is increasingly favored by regulators. And or provide decision-making aids to participants to support understanding and reasoning, such as layering consent and giving study information in little understandable chunks. Of course, suicidality is a critical factor in mental health, and I will touch on that in one of my forthcoming slides. So, moving on and thinking about equality and diversity, and legislation is being formally introduced in the US next year, but this is also being an area of ongoing discussion in the EU and the UK, and is an important factor in this specific population. It is recognized that men generally underreport mental health difficulties, particularly mood disorders such as depression and anxiety. But also there's an understanding that ethnicity and race can inform perceptions of self, as well as self in relation to mental health. And in certain ethnic and racial groups, men and women are known to be less likely to seek treatment assistance and treatment itself. And not to forget, increasing considerations and their impact on mental health should be paid to the LGBTQ community, as individuals are known to be much more likely to experience mental health illness, but also the stigma associated with this. James already touched on the economic burden, and this is not just applicable on a societal level, but of course it is impactful on the individual level. Financial means are a recognized barrier to clinical trials participation. So for this patient group, loss of ability to work or work at all times, or being able to consistently obtain social benefit due to just poor daily functioning makes participation maybe just too costly. Some thoughts are required on how to mitigate this, and Maisha will talk on this further later. Lastly, I would like to touch on often differing experiences when it comes to psychiatric care. Chronic psychiatric illness and associated admissions to acute care often come with an array of traumatic experiences to patients as well as friends and families. And often these engagements inform experiences and how mental health services are perceived. So this often informs on how well patients engage with their mental health care provider. And these factors might come into play when individuals consider their trial's participation or not. Next slide, please. So Access to mental health services can be a challenge, and that is applicable globally. And when thinking about recruitment strategies for psychiatric trials, a wide netting approach might be required to participant identification and recruitment, as James mentioned already. And particularly important is that when considering the variability of entry points into the mental health care system. The vast majority of patients will be managed in primary care settings and enter care via their primary care practitioners or general practitioners. Mild or moderate presentations of, for example, depression are often solely managed there. Others, and this is partially due to the stigma of the disease associated with the disease, but also due to the disparity of access to timely specialist assessment and care, individuals self-refer to private practitioners who may not in all cases be associated with a larger specialist academic or private center, or are actually able to offer research to their research or clinical trials to their patients. Often individuals, because they wish not to be engaged with any of the two options I just discussed, come into the healthcare system via acute admissions in a crisis situation. And often crisis admissions are followed by supportive outpatient care, or others are leading to a very quick discharge back into the primary care setting, where care can be disrupted and might not be continuous. And lastly, speaking about community groups that James touched on, there's a group of individuals who are not receiving regular mental health care or do not wish to engage with any formal care or follow-up. And we have a beautiful UK-based example of an initiative that's supported by the Menshets Association, and the Menshets initiative provides a safe space for men in particular, solely for men, to create, converse and connect and seek peer support for themselves. And initiatives like this could be considered when thinking about creative strategies for participant identification. Next slide, please. I thought it might be useful to speak about a specific example, how I, as an advanced clinical practitioner, can implement my hands-on experience and understanding of this complex and vulnerable population, as well as site processes, contribute to ensure study efficiency and success. In a recent project involving participants with major depressive episodes, suicidality was an important safety endpoint. However, it is also a symptom indicative of disease severity, and it is of clinical relevance. Keeping the participant at the center when thinking about suicidality, suicidal ideation, or exacerbation of disease presentation, a good starting point is to consider what is normal for the population and what is not in line with what we would expect to see, how to capture this and how to manage it with regards to safety of the individual as well as overall study conduct. Keeping this as well as regulatory preferences in mind for this particular study, we implemented the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale as clinical outcome assessment prospectively during each assessment time point. And of course, it's a regulatory favorite, and the FDA has released guidance on how to analyze and manage data coming from the CSSRS. We supported decisions on appropriate critical alert settings, signal investigation and resolutions. We considered this as well as site staff administration in EDC and ECRF build and edit checks. We supported implementation of a regular aggregate safety data review to identify and monitor safety trends. And we supported the development and implementation of a resolution pathway. And this included study site management and availability of a local suicide risk escalation plan, allowing for individual follow-up of participants, but also aided reconciliation of EDC queries. And this resulted in study success, safe patients, satisfied sponsors, and very happy regulators. And speaking about some of the operational aspects, I would like to hand over to Jill, who will discuss some of this further.
Thanks, Daniela. Yeah, so I'd like to change gears a little bit and talk about endpoint protection. There's a bunch of operational challenges that we face when executing clinical trials in psychiatry. Unfortunately, we don't have time today to really dive deeply into all of these. So I'm going to focus on the patient side of things, which are really the items that are highlighted in orange. Psychiatry trials are at very high risk of failure, and this is due to difficulties with mitigating placebo response and really the subjective nature of our common study endpoints. Most of our endpoints are based on clinician interviews and scales and questionnaires that are completed by patients, which all have high potential for patients to answer inconsistently across study visits. One of the ways that we can manage these risks is with robust education and training of patients and keeping a focus on patient burden during protocol development. So in the next couple slides, I'm going to focus on how we can support collection of higher quality data by keeping our patients top of mind and really focusing on providing high quality education and training and minimizing patient burden during the study as much as possible. Next slide. One of the first challenges that we face is there are many outcome measures to choose from in psychiatry. There are multiple options for assessing symptoms of depression, anxiety, and disordered thinking. The issue that we have is that quality of responses from patients can be impacted by patient fatigue or their perception of burden. Whether it's long study visits or specific assessments that take a long time to complete, it could be administration of multiple assessments which collect similar information and can feel repetitive. The overall outcome and impact on the study is the same, which is lower quality data. Patients may not be as thoughtful in their responses, or responses may not accurately reflect their reality if they feel overly burdened by the time needed to complete these assessments, or if they feel that questions are very repetitive in nature. So because of this, it's important that we are really selective about the scales and assessments we decide to include in a trial. We really need to strike a balance between making sure we're collecting the desired information to support our endpoints, but also avoiding having overly burdensome study visits. So some things to think about are, the length of time required to complete clinician interviews, the number of questions that may be included on a patient-reported outcome measure, and the level of overlap between assessments. To address this, we may need to decrease the number of planned assessments or focus on utilizing shorter questionnaires that can be completed more quickly. So really putting thought into this aspect when we're writing the protocol can improve our data quality. We also need to think about the frequency of study visits. So as an example, there is a current focus on fast-acting treatments for depression, and it's not uncommon for these protocols to require weekly visits. This may not really be practical for patients that are working full-time jobs and balancing family and personal commitments. So ultimately, it will impact the diversity of patients enrolled and overall retention of patients in the study. We could be setting up a situation where participation is effectively limited to patients that aren't working full-time because our visits are too long and patients can't get time off work every week. Or we may have patients drop out after the first couple of study visits because they ultimately determine that, wow, this is really long. I didn't appreciate just how much time this was going to be. And so they don't want to keep coming to the study site. So neither one of these situations are good for a study. And so we really need to be, again, thinking about what's truly required to assess treatment response and collect our safety data, and really think about how this could impact patient interest in the study and their willingness to keep coming in for future visits. One of the options that we can think about is leveraging remote assessments. This could be maybe to shorten the time of an on-site study visit, or perhaps it can replace in-person visits to a site. So if we want to assess the patient on a weekly basis, maybe they only need to come into the site every other week. But we can utilize things like telehealth or an ePro system to allow data to be collected while the patient's at home. This can really be a good way to decrease the length of study visits and also decrease the frequency that patients need to come to the study site. So as an example, maybe the PRO questionnaires can be completed the day before an on-site visit, so that when patients are actually on site, it's to complete assessments that really can only be completed in person. There may also be wearable technology that could be leveraged to support data collection, which again is going to have a lower impact on the patient's time. So in general, we really need to be thinking about all of these things when we're writing our protocols to make sure we have a good balance. Next slide. The other piece we need to be thinking about is really how best to support our patients with providing honest, accurate information. It's important that patients are providing accurate information, otherwise the data isn't going to be useful. So this can really have a significant impact on the study data, and really making sure that our patients are engaged with the study and understand why we're asking them to complete these questionnaires can really improve patient attention to the questionnaires and making sure that they're providing, quality responses. Clinician interviews and questionnaires that are used in clinical trials often require sharing sensitive information. So if we expect our patients to answer honestly and accurately, we need to make sure we're providing assurances that their information will remain private so they can feel comfortable answering questions that may feel embarrassing or awkward to answer. This is where robust education and training can really help reduce response variability and improve the overall quality of the data. So PRO questions could be perceived by patients as unimportant or maybe not directly related to their condition. So for those specific questions, they may be tempted to either skip them because it feels very personal and they don't want to answer, or maybe they don't provide a thoughtful response. They just basically pick an answer that sounds good, but may not really be an accurate representation of how they're feeling. Part of quality education is also setting expectations by providing information about the types of questions they'll be asked and general instructions about how to respond. So we really want our patients to understand that these questionnaire responses are important to the success of the trial. We need to be offering reassurance that the way they respond to questions is not going to impact the care they receive from clinicians, and again, that their privacy is going to be protected. Quality training also needs to address the recall period of an assessment to ensure that patients aren't including information about events that occurred outside the reporting period. So as an example, if we're asking about a patient's level of depression in the previous 24 hours, we don't want them to be thinking about something that happened last week when their symptoms may have been significantly different. We also want to make sure that patients are educated about the use of placebos in the study. And providing them regular reminders that they may not see an improvement in their symptoms, either because they're assigned to the placebo arm or maybe the drug isn't working for them. But this is okay. We don't have expectations about how they're going to respond. There is not a correct answer, and we don't want them trying to please the evaluator. What we want them to focus on is really answering the questions, responding to interview questions or questionnaire data as honestly and accurately as possible. And this is what really helps ensure that we get quality, accurate data in a trial. With that, I'm going to turn over to Maisha, who's going to speak in more detail about site and patient engagement.
Thank you, Jill. We have discussed the empowerment of patients, which I will discuss more in a moment in terms of operationalizing patient support. But I did want to take some time to reiterate the importance of site engagement and making sure that our clinical research sites feel empowered as they execute studies. Site staff are really at the center of ensuring that our studies are enrolled on time, that patient safety is put first, and that the critical data needed to advance new treatment options is collected. It is important that we support sites throughout the cycle of enrollment and study treatment by providing the necessary tools needed to conduct the study properly, including training and educational tools, supporting sites with their specific patient pathways, and making sure that we have the appropriate budgets to operationalize the study at a site level. This will allow for an ecosystem where the site facilitates participation of the appropriate patients. It will help to improve retention overall in the study. It will enhance our data quality. It will support the site in terms of their decision-making on the study. It will support managing burdens both at a site and patient level. And this will result in overall improved trial outcomes. Now, jumping back to our patient engagement strategies, if we want to advance forward. We really want to ensure that our patients are supported and connected throughout the study. All of the panelists today talked about the patient journey and talked about ensuring that we provide the appropriate educational tools to patients. So what that means is ensuring that our educational materials are robust, that they focus on how this study can support the mental health of the patient. The study tools that are provided should be in multiple languages. We should always remember to take a sensitive approach to tool development, really develop to destigmatize mental health issues. And also remembering that tools should be available at the start of the study to enhance the selection of patients, but also to ensure that the most appropriate patients, I know James spoke on that earlier in terms of picking the appropriate patients that are most likely to respond. So it's really important that we have those educational and training materials available from the very start of the study. When we're looking at overall trial experience from a patient perspective, Daniela touched on this, but I just want to reiterate that sites must provide flexibility in terms of scheduling, that it's very important that we're engaging with caregivers and family members to create a study-friendly ecosystem outside of the site where their family members are also engaged. Providing services that remove the barriers and burdens of participation, such as transportation reimbursement, and reimbursements for meals and parking, and also the allowance of home health when it makes sense for the study. We also need to ensure that we are keeping patients motivated to complete the study. And so what that means is staying connected with patients and families through multiple touch points. And so speaking with sites about multiple site phone calls over the course of the study and between visits. Allowing for study newsletters, both directed at sites and patients that provide more information about the study. And then also patient apps, considering using those so that patients can stay connected. Also providing wellness and protocol-related items at a specific cadence throughout the study to keep patients motivated to continue. And also providing things such as free mental health screenings for family members. Again, creating that ecosystem around the patient where you have their families, their caregivers, their friends who are also connected to the study and to the site. And then ensuring that we're connecting to communities. And so partnering with advocacy groups, local mental health organizations, support groups, and community hubs to drive awareness for the study. At our sites, hosting informational webinars and community events to engage directly with our patients, and then working cross-functionally with psychiatrists, psychologists, and primary health physicians for referral pathways. This keeps us connected, ensures that we are enrolling the most appropriate patients from the community, but that also the study is staying top of mind. I'm now going to walk through how we can support with specific tools to support education and engagement. So from a patient-focused tools, we recommend providing patient educational tools that create awareness and educate patients and caregivers on the specific study criteria. Most importantly, beyond the criteria, it's also their commitment to the study. And so that you have patients that not only enroll, but they're committed to completing those assessments, they're committed to completing the visits, and committed to remaining in the study. So materials, again, should be written in a participant-friendly language that is sensitive to this target population. And some of the tools that have been extremely helpful for us on our studies include the development of really robust brochures. So brochures that not only talk about the key inclusion-exclusion criteria, but also provide a patient-friendly visit schedule within them. Again, allowing patients and caregivers to look specifically at the study criteria and their overall commitment. Providing a participant handbook that would also include that study visit schedule, written in a language that is appropriate for the patient so that they understand, and they understand what's going to happen at each visit. And then providing clinical research overview videos. What's been helpful are answering questions such as what's an informed consent, what's my role as a clinical research participant, and also what is clinical research, so that patients have a better understanding of research in general. And then at a site level, making sure that we are providing educational tools that are supportive for patients identifying and sharing information with colleagues, again, to solicit those referrals. These are written for medical professionals, so they're going to be a bit different than in terms of the language that we use for our patient-focused materials, but they will still include that key criteria for patient identification. And some of the recommended tools that have worked really well across our studies have been providing items such as a pre-screen checklist, where sites can quickly identify patients within their database who may be eligible for the study to see if they would bring them in for additional screening. And also providing an educational PowerPoint for their referral colleagues that provide more details where they can do things such as a lunch and learn to gain awareness and to speak more about the study. I'm now going to dig into how do we recruit a diverse patient population. So James spoke earlier about recruiting from the community based on real patients. And then Daniela also spoke to how certain groups are not likely to seek care. And so we really do want to make sure that our clinical trials are an option for everyone and are really reflective of the population that will ultimately use the treatment. Here are just a few examples of how we as a community can support clinical trials becoming a care option for everyone. This includes, again, robust site training, making sure that sites have the tools necessary to recruit from outside of their site into the community, but also understand the types of patients that we're looking for. Providing those tools, again, in multiple languages and also at a level that can be understood by the patient. So when you're looking at your sites, what areas, even in the US, what areas are they in? What types of patients will they recruit? Do they have the appropriate staff also on site that can help support that recruitment of those diverse patients? Providing a culturally sensitive approach when speaking to patients about clinical research, knowing your patients, and that's going to really come at a site level, and then also providing that patient and travel and reimbursement services to remove the patient, that burden from patients that we really find may happen when you're recruiting patients directly from the community. And then always remaining engaged, so developing those relationships within the community so that you are not dropping in just for your clinical research study, but you have ongoing patient community engagement, that research is always in front and center for patients, so that when a clinical trial does become available for them, that they've heard about clinical research, that they are familiar with the site, and that they are willing to then join the clinical research study. I will now turn it back to James, who will provide an overall summary and wrap up.
Okay, thank you, Maisha. So, so as you've heard, we're trying to shift the emphasis of the trials from the kind of top-down, find the patients, look at the therapy and measure the result, to really something that's more patient-centric. One of the most important aspects is that it really takes agreement and understanding with everyone involved. From the sponsor point of view, none of this actually comes free. Well, some of it comes free, but some of the things that we do, like increasing adherence, rater training, and changing trial design so that we increase screen failure rate, make trials run slower and be more expensive. So I often say the most expensive trial is a failed trial. So I think that in general, it's worth looking at where investment can be made in running a trial to modestly increase the cost, or perhaps increase the time a bit, in order to increase the odds of a successful trial that actually shows that the drug works, because that's really what everyone is in this for. And as well, the sites need to buy into it, because it doesn't matter how much you talk about selecting the right patients and who you think will respond, unless the sites actually hear you and seek out those patients and institute all of these placebo mitigation strategies and endpoint protection that Jill talked about. It's all for nothing. And so everyone needs to be on board. And I think it really needs to be discussed multiple times, kept to front of mind as the trial is going on, that here's what we're trying to do. And then really it's, in summary, meeting the patient where they are, this kind of community-based recruitment, outreach, not simply mass advertising or looking at databases for the usual suspects, but seeking diverse populations. And then once patients cross that threshold to come to a site, engage them in the research endeavor. And then, as you heard, there's a lot of burden from having mental illness and psychiatric problems. And so we really want to help the patient, make it easy for them to join the study, participate, and be compliant in the study, and listen to them and engage with them for their experience, both good and bad, so that we and our sites and everyone understands the next time out how we can make things better. So I think we probably have a few minutes for questions. So let me turn it back over to the moderator.
Yes, excellent. Thank you so much for that, James, and thank you to all of our speakers today for your excellent presentation. We are now ready to begin the Q&A portion of the event, and as we do so, I invite the audience to continue sending their questions or comments. Just a reminder, if you're attending via GoToWebinar, please use the questions chat box, and for those of you watching on LinkedIn Live events, feel free to post your questions using the comments tab. We do have a little bit of time left for these questions, but rest assured to our audience members, if we don't have a chance to get to your question, you will have a chance to follow up after the webinar with the team. We have already received quite a few questions from the audience. I'm going to go ahead and kick off with the first one here. And James, I think this one's probably best suited for you to shed some insight on. This audience member was asking about the exclusion of non-responders, mentioning that approximately 20% of psychiatric patients who maybe don't respond to available medicines, if we do exclude them, perhaps we're not seeing the whole picture of the new drug's effect. And the question here is essentially, would it make sense to keep the same proportion of non-responders in clinical trials as it is in the general population? How do you handle that kind of scenario?
Right. So it's a great question, and it's really, I think, as you're pointing out, is a balance between ecologically valid trials of really being the patient population that's going to receive the medication and trial sensitivity. And it really depends on the benefit and risk of the drug. So if you have a modification of a drug that is similar in potential efficacy to first-line therapy, you're best off trying to find a patient population that is like a first-line therapy. One of the things that we're actually fortunate in psychiatric trials is that we haven't put the kind of strictures on ourselves in general that some other areas have, where one needs to only include patients who have failed all conventional medicines. Because with someone with mild to moderate depression, certainly being in a relatively short-term drug, we even actually in some of our trials wean patients off their current therapy, and they then go into a placebo-controlled period in our trials. So that's all risk mitigation and ensuring. Now, one of the things that is also implied in the question, which I think is interesting, is some of the trial designs that we've come up with to actually see whether or not a patient is a potential responder to the drug, and then re-randomize patients who are not responding to placebo. So again, that is a presumed bias in the trial to look at patients who might be more informative. And so just in general, I think this is true of many areas that we're balancing the artificiality of the clinical trial and sensitivity with the real patient population.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that answer there, James. I think we have time to hit a few more questions here from the audience. But again, just a reminder, feel free to continue sending in your questions, and we'll have a chance to follow up after the webinar, even if we run out of time here today. This next question here may be best suited for Maisha to shed some insight on this one. This audience member was asking about how MedPace can practically assist sites with community outreach when it comes to trying to enroll a more diverse set of patients. Perhaps you could shed a little bit of light on which approaches have shown the most success in the past.
Sure, thank you, and thank you for the question. So realistically, MedPace can help support through the development of community engagement, actually budgets directly to the sites. We understand that recruiting a diverse patient population takes time, and developing those relationships take time. So providing budgets for sites to be able to initiate that support. But we can also help, and we do help in terms of building those relationships with community groups and connecting sites to maybe some of the resources that are unknown to them. We do work also on a national and regional level with some organizations that also help to build the enrollment of diverse patient populations. Some of the other things in terms of providing direct support, MedPace has a travel and reimbursement services, and so we can offer travel reimbursement support directly to patients, so removing that burden from the sites and providing it directly to patients, or we can also provide transportation and support budgets to sites for them to manage. And so really it's about, we look at community outreach, recruitment of diverse patient populations outside of, site selection. We look at it from holistically supporting the sites where they can also then support the patients. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Maisha. Just looking at time here, I think we have a moment now just for one final question before we wrap up. But again, I'll just reiterate that we will have a chance to follow up with our audience members who ask questions who we haven't had a chance to get to today. This final question here, I think probably best suited for Jill to take this one. This audience member was mentioning how across the presentation, our presenters spoke to several materials that enable the participant to understand the level of commitment before trial trial participation in the recruitment phase and then versus, once they're enrolled. And the audience member was just asking if you could share which tools were most effective for trials requiring longer visits to ensure safety measures of any responses to the treatment.
Yeah, so I think this is something that can be interwoven into a lot of our materials for consistency, but the first place to start really is with the informed consent. I think we do a good job of informed consents, of letting patients know about potential risks, and certainly, we'll kind of lay out for them the different types of procedures that are going to happen in a study. But we don't always do as good a job actually outlaying for them what the time commitment truly is. Again, things may be talked about at a very high level, and so it may not be clear to patients about what the time commitment truly is. So actually explicitly stating in the consent the expected duration of each of the study visits, so they can really be considering that. The other thing that MedPace oftentimes will create for a study is what we refer to as a patient journey. It's basically looks kind of like a placemat and really, again, outlines for the patient what's going to happen at a high level at each of the study visits. So again, this can be used to really highlight potential time commitment. And then the other piece, because patients don't always remember to go back to the consent, really would be a patient handbook. And again, in the patient handbook, making sure that we're being very explicit about the time commitment. I think all of these types of things, and really making sure that we have a consistent message across the various materials we provide, really help patients have a better understanding of exactly how long visits may take. Because again, you could, if it just says questionnaires in the consent, well, that could be 5 minutes, that could be an hour, depending on what's needed. So really, I think mostly being very explicit with patients and making sure that when sites are talking to patients about the study, that they're also being very clear and transparent with patients about what the time commitment is, how long they're going to need to stay at each visit. We have some studies sometimes that a visit might take 5 or 6 hours, and that definitely could impact whether or not a patient is able to feasibly participate.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that answer, Jill, and thank you to all of our presenters for tackling those answers during the Q&A session. Unfortunately, we have reached the end of this portion of the event, and as I mentioned earlier, to our audience members who asked questions, we couldn't attend to them, or if you have any further questions, or if you're someone who's watching the recording of this webinar, you can get in touch with the team at MedPace using the contact info on screen, a very simple info@medpace.com email address, and they'll have a chance to follow up with you after the webinar. I do thank everyone once again for participating. If you are attending via GoToWebinar, I have added a link in the chat box where you'll be able to view the recording of this event. And you can, of course, share this link with your colleagues so that they may register to view it as well. You'll also be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recording. And after we wrap things up here, a survey window will appear on your screen. Your participation in this survey is always appreciated as it helps us to improve our webinars. For those of you watching on LinkedIn Live, we encourage you to create an account on xtalks.com and register for this event, which will not only give you access to today's recording, but to our entire library of content. And now I'd just like to thank our speakers once more for their excellent presentation. James, Daniela, Jill, Maisha, we really appreciate your time and your insights. We hope our audience found this informative, and we wish you all a great rest of your day. Take care, everyone.